real nice. You don't know me.
Hey, what's up guys, it's Arun, and today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to turn an old computer case into something super clean, super modern. It's a really fun project to get inside, especially while we're stuck here at home in 2020. It's a really fun project and definitely something you could do with your kids, so let's get started. So to start off with, you're going to need a computer case, something old, something scruffy, maybe just something's thrown out. I ended up picking my computer case from one of my neighbors. He chucked it out onto the street, straight into the trash. This type of case is a really perfect candidate for what we're about to do to it. You could probably pick up a computer case that's secondhand on like Facebook for free, or even for like $5 or $10, and it would be a perfect case for what we're going to do with it. So my case actually came with some computer components, had some old Core 2 quad inside. After I'd taken all the computer components out of the computer, I ended up taking off the front panel. That's when I found the USB hub and the mic in and mic out. The original case had a power button and a reset switch. I ended up actually using the reset switch as my power button just because it had a smaller footprint and I thought it fit the build that I was envisioning a lot better. Once you remove the front panel and all the internal components from the computer, make sure you keep them on the side in a really safe spot. You never want to lose any of this stuff. It's always useful to hold on to it for future purposes. So I also had some mangled up edges on this case, which I tried to smooth over with pliers, but I was really not getting anywhere with it, especially after like 20 minutes. I tried very hard. I couldn't really smooth off the metal at all, so I just thought I'd leave it. So next up, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to wash down the computer case completely. Make sure that it doesn't have any contaminants inside it. There's lots of dirt in there that can definitely stuff up your paint job, so just use a hose outside and clean everything out. And once you finish that, what I did, because we're in Australia in the winter, it's really not going to dry by itself, so I took some rags and I just wiped it down with some paper towels. And once I'd finished that, I used an alcohol wipe and I went over the entire case to make sure that there wasn't any oil contaminants from my hands that might affect the paint job that I was about to apply. Once you finish cleaning the case, you're going to want to paint it now. So lay out a lot of cardboard on the floor outside. You want to make sure you're doing a really well ventilated area, because this spray paint can definitely give you some breathing problems if you're doing it in a confined area. So make sure you go outside and put some cardboard down or some surface so you don't spray paint on like your driveway or deck or something. Give yourself enough room, and you're going to want to paint according to the instructions on the can. For me, I used DY Mark's Grey Primer. This paint was really good. It has 350 milliliters of paint in the can, and it covered the entire process of the case and the panels without any problems, so I definitely recommend that can of spray paint. With the actual case itself, you're going to want to hit it with a few coats from the top, so I used 4 coats facing on top of the case, trying to get every angle I could, and then you're going to want to flip the case over into another 3 coats underneath it, just so that you can get every angle under the case, which you probably wouldn't get from the top. And there'll still be certain corners that you might not be able to get the paint into, just because we're not disassembling the case here. It's a little bit hard to make sure that you hit every angle, but you want to make sure you hit as much as possible, otherwise the paint won't stick to the actual metal itself. It needs the primer to stick onto. So once you've finished painting the case with the primer, you're going to move on to the side panel. The left hand side panel we're going to be cutting, so we'll start with the right hand side panel, and really all we're doing here is just washing it. And once we've finished that, wipe it down with a alcohol wipe and then paint it again with the grey primer. I used about 2 or 3 coats as well before flipping it over and doing 2 or 3 coats of primer again. I can't stress this enough, guys. Follow the instructions in the can, wait about half an hour between coats, make sure you're in a well ventilated area and you'll be totally fine. So next up, we're going to cut out the side panel for the clear glass window, and you start off this by measuring in the side window. You want to make sure you give enough space for the mechanism, so when the case is closing with that panel, the glass actually won't get in the way of the mechanism, so it doesn't stop the case from working the way it should. So for me, that was 3 centimeters in from every flat edge. I measured it all up, and then I used a screw to score a line into the paint of the actual panel. And what this did is when I was cutting, it gave me an opportunity to see that line at all times, rather than following that pencil mark that would be used usually. Use a screw or something to cut a line into the paint so that you can definitely see what you're cutting. Alright, so it's a really fun opportunity now. It's time to cut the panel, and I use an angle grinder. You can get these very locally at the hardware shop, or you can borrow them from local hardware dealers. It's very important to watch a lot of safety guidelines. I actually filled out a little safety checklist document, and if you're doing this with someone like your kids, it's really useful to fill out a document like this. You can appropriately identify all the hazards involved in using an angle grinder and a power tool like this, because there's a lot of harm that can come to you if you use this tool incorrectly, and there's a lot of safety procedures that you definitely want to follow while using a power tool like this. And the main technique here is you really want to take your time as you're cutting out the panel. It took me about 2 hours, which is probably a lot longer than if someone was really professional with the angle grinder, but for someone like me who's never used an angle grinder before, it took me about 2 hours. And you really want to take your time and make sure that you're not making any marks on the part of metal that you're going to be keeping, in other words, the outside of the frame. So just make sure when you're cutting, you're really careful not to touch the frame in any way that could leave a permanent mark. Then it's time to deburr the entire panel. So you're going to want to take a file and clamp the panel down to some form of surface like a bench top, and then just use a file and be very careful not to touch the edges of the panel, because it can definitely cut you with a lot of those sharp edges. So file them all away. Once you finish that, you can use some sandpaper. I use some really rough grit sandpaper to get rid of all the burrs and the edges and make a nice round edge to the piece of metal. So once you've finished doing all that, it's time to clean off this panel and paint it. Really fun time, because you really put a lot of effort into this. So hit it up with about 3 coats of primer onto the frame, and then flip it over and do about 3 coats there as well. Now before I did the final coat of white paint onto the actual case, I actually drilled out a hole for the power button, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But you just want it to be about the size of the button itself that you want to protrude out of the case, and just, yeah, make it into a good spot. For me, that was about 3 centimeters in from each edge of the corner at the top of the case. So once you got everything together, I think it's time to spray paint the whole thing white. And that's probably my favorite step, because it's when you start to see this case really taking shape. You can do the same procedures with the primer. For me, I use Rustoleum's 2X coverage paint and primer, and I use the ultra matte white look, and it came out really clean. I really love the look of this Rustoleum paint, so I definitely recommend it. There was a little bit less paint in this can compared to the primer can, and I did notice that I ran out before I wanted to do a final coat, and unfortunately, because of COVID, all of the hardware stores are actually out of paint right now, which is a bit of a bummer. So once you've finished painting everything, make sure you take your time and let this all dry. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes people make, is they don't give themselves enough time. This whole procedure of painting took me a couple of days, but it definitely gives a better result if you give the paint enough time to cure and dry properly. So while the paint is drying, it's a really fun time. It's time to install the front wooden panel. I did this by first measuring the front of my case and cutting out a piece of wood that would be appropriate for that size. I just used a handsaw, and the cut actually came out really poor. It took a long time to cut, and once I had finished, I realized I was off by a couple of millimeters. So all I did was I cut off the bad edge and then filed it flat. But if you use some sandpaper and a file, you can definitely get a nice clean edge. So I fitted the piece of wood onto the case itself by just placing it first onto my bench top, and then I placed the case face down on top of the wood and marked out the holes using a pencil, and I drilled some holes into the piece of wood that were slightly smaller than the bolts I wanted to install in the case. Once I'd finished this, I just used a ratchet and some of the bolts, and I used a nut to make a bit of a spacing, and then just simply screwed the piece of wood onto the front of the case. You're going to want to take your time with this step, because you definitely don't want to make the holes too close to the edge, otherwise they'll chip off the piece of wood and all that work would be for nothing. So take your time, mark the holes properly, and yeah, just be a bit careful on this step. So one of the final steps, a really fun one, is installing the side panel. And to do this, all you need is a piece of acrylic. I actually didn't have any acrylic cutters on me, so what I did was I marked up the area of the panel you want. You just want it to be a little bit indented from the outside of the frame so that it has something to grab onto. And I didn't have an acrylic cutter, so what I did was I just used a knife to make a bit of a groove, and then I use a paint spreader, and I just use the edge of it because it's flat, and I ran it about 40 times over the straight edge, and then I was able to just snap the acrylic panel clean off. I used some double-sided Gorilla Tape to attach the acrylic panel. Now, that's some really strong stuff, so if you're going to use this, make sure that you place it properly. I cut the tape in half before placing it, but it still made pretty much a permanent seal onto the acrylic panel, and it's not coming off anytime soon. Finally, it's time to install the power button into your case. So depending how you want to do it, you could put it onto the side panel, but for me I installed it into the top of the case. So the first thing I did was I drilled out the reset switch holder from the old case, and I cut it to size, and I sanded it down to a point where I could install it straight into my case without having much of work cut out for me. So what I really did was I sanded it down so that the button was protruding out the top of the holder for the reset switch from the old case, and then I just hot glued it into my new case facing down so that the new switch protrudes straight out of my panel, and I can actually press it from the top of the case. So finally guys, we're going to add the feet back to the case that we took off in the beginning, and this is really simple. You just put it into place and pop the little button through the bottom, and there you go. You have finished making a really badass, a really sleek, ultra modern 2020 looking computer case. If you enjoyed this video guys, please share it with your friends if you did. Yeah, thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you all in the next one.
Real nice.